for the second session of the day, clearly very much anticipated. Please join me in welcoming to the stage for the session Selfie, presented by Hindustan Times, Stephen Fry, Helen Macdonald, Blake Morrison, Brigid Keenan, Christina Lamb, Esther Freud, and the moderator Samanth Subramanian. There will be signings after the session back in the book signing area. I've told you this before, but in case anyone's missed it, that signing area is at the far left corner of the Rajnigandha Silver Pearls front lawn. There will be signings there. Please, please do not crush the authors on the way to the signing. We're really trying to look after their well-being. And there will be a Q&A session at the end of the discussion.
Okay.
Are you taking a selfie? If you want to tweet about the session, please do so. The hashtag is ZJLF, ZEEJLF. There are prizes going out for the best and most frequent tweets later today. And for those of you who don't know where the bookshop is, it's the Full Circle bookstore over near the Charbagh venue over this way. Please do make your way there for books after the session, and you can happily have those signed once the session is over.
Should I grab water? Goodness me.
Not yet. Oh.
I've just been informed also that there are questions coming up on the screen here. If you wish to participate in the discussion, keep an eye on those questions, and you can participate in the conversations there online.
I was brought up not to talk about myself,
Yeah.
so you're writing.
So you wrote it instead.
So, no.
No, they don't. Okay, I think maybe I'll start sort of introductory remarks while Esther's been mic'd up. Welcome to the biggest panel in the history of the Jaipur Literature Festival. There are 7 of us on stage, in case you're counting. At other literary festivals, we would be an audience in and of ourselves. So I think the best way to go about this is to sort of go around with 1, maybe 2 questions apiece. You'll all got 7 minutes to talk each. Please distill all your wisdom into 7 minutes, your life's experiences, all of that, and we can proceed. The panel is titled Selfie, and the sort of the topic we'll be talking about is memoir writing, the art of the memoir, why we write memoirs, and it might be useful to sort of distinguish memoir from autobiography for a little bit. Autobiography, in my opinion at least, is sort of a comprehensive account of one's life. I think a memoir is sort of more narrowly focused, maybe on certain ideas or events or a particular phase in your life that you think changed you and made you the person you are. But, this definition is open to interpretation. Please do feel free to contradict me. Brigid, if we start with you.
Oh, well, I don't know.
I haven't asked a question yet, though. It's on. No, I think what I was going to say is your 2 works as a trailing spouse, as you call it, fit so classically into this definition of memoir, right? Where you went with your husband to these amazing places and had adventures. And I wanted to ask you sort of what the genesis was of these 2 books. When you decided to sit down and put them into memoir form? I mean, what was the impetus to do that?
Right, well, I have to start off by saying that writing memoirs fills me with total guilt, because I was brought up in a generation that was not allowed to speak about itself. So when I was a little girl, if I talked about myself or said anything about my emotions, somebody would say, oh, we've got a little touch of me-itis today, have we? Or they'd say, oh, something that put you down, little misnotice box. And then I went into journalism, and when I went into journalism, which was decades ago, you were never allowed to use the word I or talk about your own experiences. You had to always report in the third person. Anyway, then I married a journalist. Oh, sorry, I didn't marry a journalist at all. I married
a diplomat.
Yes, sorry. I was thinking about being a journalist and marrying a diplomat. And my diplomat husband was posted to places around the world, and I wrote a book about Kashmir from India, and I wrote a book about Damascus in Syria. And then we were posted to Kazakhstan. I don't know whether any of you have been to Kazakhstan. Have you? Have you really?
Yes. I wouldn't lie to you on stage in front of these people.
The memoir is upcoming.
Good. And in Kazakhstan, I didn't speak Russian, I didn't speak Kazakh. There were no old buildings to look at. True or false, Helen? And I couldn't think of anything to write about. Actually, there was one story I wanted to write, but I wasn't allowed to write it. It was about how when they opened the big gulag in Karaganda in 1992, when the Soviet Union collapsed, none of the prisoners left because they had nowhere to go. And I wasn't allowed to write that story. Anyway, so then I turned to my diaries, which I'd always kept, and I put them into these two books that were referred to. And basically, they were just about me. And I sort of felt riddled with guilt that all I could think of is to write about me. And when I give talks, all I talk about is me. And I wish I could talk about the Afghan war or anything except me. But anyway, it's obviously addictive, because I've just finished a memoir about my childhood in India, because I was born in India. My father was in the Indian Army. He was very proud to serve in the 17th Dogra Regiment. But writing this memoir has kind of confused me about memory, because I can't remember the number plate of my car, but I can remember how to say Little Miss Muffet in Hindustani. And I was taught this when I was 6.
Please.
And shall I say it?
Yes. Hands
Are
like
you
this,
sure?
come on, hands like this.
But it's in Hindustani, and I probably got it all wrong because I just learnt it. Should I really say it?
Yes, yes, yes.
So, that's it. Mafati mai, dood malai, ek bara gas pa baita. Ek bara makri, sari ko pakri, bahagya mafati mai.
I think you've...
Did it make sense?
I think you've won this session.
She wins every session.
Yeah.
Actually, I know somebody who can, in England, who can say Humpty Dumpty in Hindustani. He's the same age as me, and his ayah taught him that instead of Mavati Mai.
So did it take a certain kind of conviction to get over this, this trauma of being called Little Miss Notice Box and me-itis? I mean, did it take an act of conviction to write these two books at all, to think that people should be interested in the life that you led?
An act of desperation.
Desperation.
Because there really was nothing for me to do, and I really couldn't think of anything to do, so
Yeah.
I had to just turn the diaries. And then also, I don't know why, but my husband and I are the kind of people that peculiar things happen to. And I'm thinking of my husband. At one point, we were posted in West Africa, and the president of our country, the Gambia, went to London, and there was a dinner given for him by the Lord Mayor. And there were 200 people at this dinner, and it was very English, city, traditional. Everybody had to go in at the same time, and then everybody had to sit down at the same time. And 200 people, or rather 199 people, sat down, and my husband had no chair. So he had to sort of go into a crouch, using his massive thigh muscles to hold him in a crouch so that he wouldn't just literally stick out like a sore thumb in this huge room. So odd things happen to us. So my diary's quite full of peculiar things.
Stephen, I believe you have a Hindi nursery rhyme for us as well.
I have a...
A Hindustani nursery rhyme.
No,
for us?
I
No.
wish I did. Oh, you're going to
Totally
disappoint everyone. I
unprepared.
don't have a
Okay.
Hindustani nursery.
Stephen Fry, as you all know, has written a set of 3 memoirs that together constitute a detailed but partial autobiography. Moab is my washpot, The Fry Chronicles, and More Fool Me. So these books are, in case you haven't read them, brutally honest in many instances about various aspects of his life, his sexuality, his cocaine habit, erstwhile, not current, his bipolar disorder. So what does the exercise of writing these memoirs do to you in terms of how you perceive your own life, or these habits, or the framework of your life?
I don't know. It's supposed to be cathartic. People always say, is it very cathartic to write about your life? I don't feel that it necessarily is. I don't feel that I'm draining a poisonous pus out of the great boil of my life. But I think, like a lot of people who have loved reading all their lives, I started out being fascinated by stories about young people growing up, because that's what you're doing when you read. And whether it's Jim Hawkins in Treasure Island, surrounded by these extraordinary figures and going on great adventures, or then later on, the one that obsessed me most was David Copperfield, whose opening lines are so wonderfully resonant for this meeting, I suppose. Whether I turn out to be the hero of my life, it is for these pages to decide, he writes when he starts the job of talking about his life. And it's very much Dickens's life, of all the books he wrote, I think. And so I was just always fascinated by casting myself as the hero of my own life. And I think we all do that. We all, as we drop off to sleep at night, we picture ourselves as heroes of one kind or another. And if it's a dangerous fantasy where we think we can fly or open the batting for England or possibly Australia, yeah, I'm sorry about that. 4-0 in the ODIs as well. It's very sad. Anyway, we start playing South Africa today. That's enough about cricket. But if it is a dangerous fantasy in which you see yourself as a hero, I think it has to be escaped, because it's essentially the problem of our culture today is that of grown-ups who should know better, eating children's food, drinking children's sparkly sugar drinks, wearing baseball caps, and going to cinema, which is all about people who can fly or go extremely cold or hot or stretch themselves. It's the entire world, principally America is leading us, are turning into children. They no longer are capable of eating adult food, drinking adult drinks. Even their drinks are, cocktails are made of sugar. Everything is made for children. And I think literature is one of the last stands against that. Even children's literature is not infantile in the way that American culture is infantile. So I think it's very important. It's very important, if we cast ourselves as heroes in our books, to recognize that a hero is entirely a flawed person. And I may have gone overboard in doing that. I'm in fact heterosexual. I've never tasted a drug in my life. But I've gone to extreme lengths to pretend otherwise, even to the extent of marrying someone of the same gender. That shows how committed I am to presenting myself as a flawed individual. No, I think the two things that are most important when writing about oneself are memory, obviously, and Brigid alluded to that. We can't be sure of how reliable memory is. The great Vladimir Nabokov called his book of memoirs Speak Memory. In fact, he wanted to call it Speak Mnemosine, who is the Greek goddess of memory, the mother of the muses. And his publisher, can you imagine? It's spelled Mnemosyne, Mnemosine. And his publisher said, Vladimir, if we put this book out in a bookshelf called Speak Mnemosine, no one will buy it. So he finally was persuaded to call it Speak Memory. But that is the thing I think all of us have done, is we've sat in a room alone asking memory to speak to us. And it's an ongoing, exciting adventure.
And the effort to dredge those memories out and to present yourself as a flawed, real individual. I mean, you know, if you read your books, the writing seems to come so easily in one sense, that the ease of writing almost must have surely masked how difficult it was to put yourself out there. I mean, sort of flaws and all.
Yes, gosh, that is true. I mean, a lot of it, and we can talk about Blake in particular, obviously has written about very deep personal things to do with family, which is something every person on the planet, unless they're the saddest orphan, will have knowledge of their family, and even an orphan will have knowledge of a surrogate family. And for me, writing is an act of expiation and apology to my family for having gone to prison when I was 17 and embarrassed them in every possible way that you could embarrass parents, who were very decent, kindly parents. And in writing the books, I didn't want to embarrass them further, so I kind of felt that the only person, when I was writing, about whom I could be brutally honest was myself, but that everybody else didn't deserve to have their lives opened up in front of the readers. And so that's part.
Yeah. Blake, I mean, since Stephen mentioned your books, Blake Morrison has 2 books that count as memoirs, I think, or at least 2 that we'll be discussing here. They're titled, "And When Did You Last See Your Father?" and "Things My Mother Never Told Me." They're both exquisite. I enjoyed reading them so much. And they perform this act of memory, of remembering his parents and the lives that they led even before he was born. And I wanted to bring up this issue that you have a problem that most biographers usually don't, in the sense that you're extremely close to the people you're writing about. You love them, they loved you. And I was wondering what sort of particular challenges that threw up. I mean, were you ever at any point uncomfortable revealing details about their lives? And then how did you make the decision about what to reveal and what to hold back?
Well, I wrote the book about my father in the year after his death, and I think I didn't censor myself at all. I wasn't even aware of what I shouldn't be saying.
Yeah.
But, you know, we have this idea that if you write about family or write about living people, that somehow it's an act of aggression, you know, to be written about. But I thought of it as paying homage, as preserving. I wanted to preserve my father in some way. As he was fading away, as he was dying, I was trying to keep him alive. It was a book about losing somebody. And then I wrote a book about my mother, which surprised even me. People said to me, "I suppose you'll write about your mother now you've written about your father. You know, don't you love your mother enough to write about her as well?" I never imagined writing about my mother, who was a mystery to me, but I did so. That's a book about finding somebody after they've died and discovering all sorts of secrets about them. But I didn't think of any of those secrets. I mean, the principal one was that my mother, an Irish Catholic, did not like to acknowledge that she was Catholic. This was completely baffling to me. What's shameful about that? And writing about her was about uncovering why there was that shame, and in a way I felt it was a book about removing an unnecessary feeling of shame and so on.
But how do you deal with this dilemma that, you know, your mother had lived her life keeping this secret from the world, and she would, I mean, I don't know if you got her consent before you wrote the book, but I mean,
No.
the fact that she would probably not wanted to have this revealed, I mean, is that something you grappled with at any point?
I grapple with it a bit, but I felt if you write a book which is not hagiography, it's not presenting living people, your family, your parents as saints, but it is respectful and affectionate and loving, that you know, she would understand that, she would understand the motivation behind the book, and she wouldn't have been offended by what was in it.
Yeah.
I'm glad you've raised this, because people think of memoir as a narcissistic, solipsistic ego trip. I thought of both of those books about other people, not about me.
Yeah.
But, you know, we think memoir inscribed in the very word, you know, me, moi, me, moi. That, you know, you're just banging on about yourself, and it's all just pouring out of you. No, you construct yourself, you're the narrator. As Stephen says, you're a flawed narrator. You know, if you're exposing things about other people around you, you've got to expose things about yourself, embarrassing things, shameful things, and you can never really second guess what living people are going to be offended by. There was a person with whom I had a relationship, let's put it that way, when I was a teenager, and I changed her name to protect her. And when the book came out, she was very angry. Why couldn't you put in my real name? Why did you have to disguise me? So it's always difficult to judge that. I think we do fictionalize. We change the color of somebody's hair and to protect them, but some people don't want to be protected.
There is an ultimate vanity that both you and Esther share, which is that through one way or another, you were played by Colin Firth, and you were played by Kate Winslet.
Yeah.
Now, that's surely the purpose of
Well,
writing an autobiography,
Yeah,
is to get paid by
yes,
Jim Broadbent.
I always say that there was a long time between my book coming out and the film coming out, and I always say this is because they wanted to take time to find the person who most closely resembled me physically. Unfortunately, Dustin Hoffman was not available, and they came up with Colin Firth.
We're going to go to Helen
Hello.
Macdonald's H is for Hawk, which won the Samuel Johnson Prize a couple of years ago, and she's been sort of championed and valorized rightly ever since. The book is only partially about taming and training a hawk. The hawk stands in a way for her own grief and emotions during an extremely difficult time in her life following her father's death. So I was curious to ask you what the process was of writing this book. I mean, were you taking notes about the process of training the hawk itself, but also about your own interior state while you were going through this time? Or was it sort of memoir in the memory sense of the word? Did you look back upon it and sort of cast those events from memory onto the page?
That's a really, really interesting question. I think if you're, I mean, it took me 5 years to get round to writing this book. It was my father's death hit me very hard. I went off the rails. I sort of trained this hawk and ran around in the mud and flew this hawk every day. And it was a dark time. It was a very beautiful time. And after about 5 years, there was enough distance from the person I was then to be able to write about me. So what interests me about that is that I became a kind of a fictional character in my own memoir. I needed to be talking to this person that wasn't me anymore, and that was interesting. But in terms of keeping notes and remembering what happened that year, it was very, very strange. I have a terrible memory. I can't really remember people's names, faces, where I was yesterday. But perhaps because of the bereavement, because of the shock of my father's sudden death, everything that in that year following his death, I can recall with crystalline clarity, and I didn't really need to take any notes at the time to remember those.
And you think the distance was necessary to you?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
I think there are two kinds of books on grief. I think there are books that are written during it, in that very strange time. And I think Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking is an extraordinary example of that. And there are those that are written much later looking back, and I had to do it that way. I couldn't have done it any other way, I think.
So let me ask you this. I mean, once you've written a memoir about a particular set of events in your life, the memory has written the memoir in one way, but how does the memoir itself and the writing of it and the production of it then shape the memory? I mean, does that change in your mind at all? Do things become sharper, fuzzier?
Things don't become sharper. You simply forget everything that isn't in the memoir, basically. You're like, oh no, that was everything that I wrote about. Everything else falls away. It's very strange. You replace memories with what you've written.
Yeah.
But I think that's quite natural. I think we all do that all the time. We all construct stories and narratives about our lives, and mine just happens to be in print.
Yeah.
But it was a weird thing to write. I had to put myself back in that time, back in that really rather crazed lady. There was a lot of swearing and a lot of pizza and crying as I wrote, and writing's a very lonely occupation, and you do start to feel, why am I doing this? And I didn't think it was in any sense, a kind of act that was going to help me kind of get over it or feel different until I finished. I put the last sentence down, and then I felt actually wobbly. I had to kind of grip the chair. And I realized it was a proper goodbye to my father and the person I'd been then. It was
So there was a sense of catharsis
There was
there
a
at all.
sense of catharsis,
Yeah,
but I
okay.
didn't know until it was finished.
Oh,
And that
that's
was a
interesting.
fascinating moment.
So why did you then start writing? I mean, if you didn't know that there was going to be catharsis at the end of it, I mean, we're all very grateful that
Why
you
do
wrote
we
the book.
write? What's
We
wrong
love
with
your
us?
book, but
Yeah.
I mean, what drove you to do it?
What drove me? This is going to sound really cheesy, but I just thought, even as that year went on and I was going out with this hawk every day and kind of living this strange life, I thought there's a story here that's bigger than me. It's much bigger than me. It's about life and death and love and loss and the natural world. And the story kind of started to kind of be quite insistent that it needed to be told. And I kept pushing it away, 5 years, no. And working with the book was odd. It felt quite soon as I got into it and writing these sort of chapters slowly, that it became something that was almost but not quite alive. And it would start to kind of push me. It's a bit like trying to lead a horse. Sometimes you could be on the horse and it's racing along, and sometimes the horse is like, I'm not moving, Buster. You're not doing any writing today. And that was fascinating. I'd never been in that situation where I felt that I was working with a memoir that was looking right back at me. It was a conversation. It was fascinating.
Yeah. That's amazing. Christina Lamb, who wrote The Sewing Circles of Herat and Farewell Kabul. The Sewing Circles is a memoir of her time spent as a reporter during the war years in Afghanistan, the late 80s, and then again in the early 2000s. And this is a sort of an act of, it's a feat of reportage in one way. It is what we call literary nonfiction or literary journalism. But this is also inflected with sort of your own eye, the reporter's eye, in both senses, the EYE as well as the I. They're both present. they guide us through this terrain that you're looking at, and you are a minor but important character in the book itself. So, and this is something I've always asked other journalists, is sort of, how do you make this decision about how much of yourself to put into a book that is essentially about other people's trauma and suffering? And the flip side of that is, does it make it effective at all? I mean, you could have written this book entirely in third person, I think, and it may have been very good. But do you think that putting yourself into the book itself sort of raised the effectiveness of the book in terms of how it communicated to readers?
Okay, so I've been sitting here thinking, I'm not quite sure why I'm on this panel.
Now you know.
I can't recite nursery rhymes in foreign languages. I haven't been played by a Hollywood actor, and I haven't really written a memoir.
Yeah.
But it is, as you say, reportage. And I think, actually, as a journalist, when I try and write about stories I cover, most of the things I cover are quite complicated. They're wars, they're conflicts in faraway places. So I always try and find a person to tell the story through, somebody whose story people back home can read and that will somehow bring it home to them and resonate in a way that a sort of just general story about the situation in Afghanistan wouldn't. So actually, I tried very hard when I was writing Farewell Couple to find another character to tell the whole story through. And it was quite difficult because I wanted to explain what I feel that much of the problems today in global jihad and terrorism link back to what happened in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and in particular how the West had encouraged jihad. And I was trying to find somebody that I could tell that story through, and I spent ages trying different ways to do it. And then in the end, I realized actually the one person who had lived through all of this and witnessed it, because I'd kept going back and forth all those years, 28 years, was actually me. And that I should write as I'd seen the things, and I wanted the reader to read about this and learn about what had happened and discover what had happened through my eyes, if you like. And I started out covering that war as a 21-year-old, completely naive, no idea what was going on in the world, no idea what foreign correspondents did. Now I'm 28 years older than that, and a mother, and covered wars all over the world, and I guess very experienced foreign journalist. And so you were supposed to read that book following my voyage of discovery, if you like, and being shocked, actually, at the things that I learned and what people were doing. And it just seemed a more powerful way to do it than in the third person.
And this dilemma of how much of yourself you wanted or needed to put into the story. I mean, is that something? Especially in a time of war, it's and I know this is true because of my own experiences. But you always feel sort of that you're bordering on self-indulgence every time you even use the personal pronoun I, because there are so many other people out there with much bigger problems that you should be writing about. So how did you sort of play this balancing game throughout the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a great fan of first-person journalism. I think we use I much too much. But in this case, I thought I'm not going to write anything in this book that I didn't actually personally witness, whether it's going inside Guantanamo or seeing the jihadi training camps in Pakistan or being with the Taliban in their early days or meeting the women who were risking their lives to write under the Taliban. All of those things are things that I was actually there, that actually met the people, saw what was happening. It's not any kind of third-hand or second-hand account. So I just thought it would give it more authenticity. But I do think that there is too much of this first person generally. And the other thing is, just to say, I mean, it's not a memoir in that, I mean, it's not, you don't read about my love life or my drug addictions or my kind of, whatever. It's just what I've seen. And I guess in the way that I wrote it, you see when I'm angry about things and really care about them. But it's not, there are other books by war correspondents, one of which is coming out as a movie soon called Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, which I'm a bit worried about, a female war correspondent and her love life in Afghanistan. And I slightly think it's going to make things really hard for those of us who are women war correspondents who fight against these stereotypes that Western women are just there to kind of, fall in love with soldiers and drink all the time and have parties. And actually now a movie's coming out by a Western female war correspondent, which seems to suggest that is all we do, and I'm worried about it.
Yeah. Colin Firth, sorry, you had a question.
No, it was simply, I would say just that the use of the first person by journalists, I think, could sometimes be immensely powerful. You are bearing witness to something. I was there, I saw this. I'm thinking of something like George Orwell's essay, A Hanging, an impersonal account of a hanging. I don't think could have the same power that he brings to it, the odd, surprising details that are in that piece. And so this idea that, reporters should be impersonal, beige, fade into the background, never bring themselves into the story, I guess I disagree with, because I think there's some tremendously powerful journalism where the narrator bearing witness is part of that power. And that's what you're doing. Okay?
Thank you. I feel happy now.
No more apologizing.
Esther Freud's book is slightly different from the others on our panel, as we discussed yesterday. Hideous Kinky is what is called an autobiographical novel, and it's based loosely or not so loosely upon your experiences in Morocco when you were young. And I wanted to ask you whether there was at some point, there was a moment of decision where you decided to go the way of the novel rather than the way of sort of straight, factual memoir, and what swung you the way of the novel? Apart from the fact that Kate Winslet could play you later, but what else?
I never made any kind of decision about how to tell it. The story came to me in its form, and I found that over my writing life, as stories come to me in forms, as a short story, as a novel, recently as a play. And so I set out to write this book. I literally never thought about it until it was finished and the first few people read it and were surprised that my narrator was a 5-year-old child, and it was told in the first person. I hadn't made any of those decisions.
Wow.
I just wanted to write something. I went to a creative writing class. I was actually working as an actress, doing a lot of writing, but for my own pleasure rather than as with any thoughts of ever being a writer. And I was asked to write some long piece in this class, and I thought I couldn't imagine doing a long piece. I could write a page maybe. But I thought, what could I write? And I thought about my childhood, which had had an incredibly strong hold on my memory. Between the ages of 4 and 6, I lived with my mother and my older sister in Morocco, and we traveled and lived there in a very kind of involved way. And when we came back to live in England, my entire memory was sort of submerged with these incredibly visually stimulating and sort of emotionally involving experiences that I'd had. And I'd been a very, what they called politely as vague child, but the reality was kind of, I didn't learn to read till I was 11. I couldn't tell the time. I was lost really in a world of dreaming. And so what occurred to me when I had to write the long piece was I'd go to this place, and I started with this image of myself sort of this high, the one photograph I had from my childhood, with my eyes sort of looking up into the camera. And from that person's point of view, I started to write some of the things that I remembered. I then got stuck really quite quickly because I didn't remember enough.
Yeah.
I remembered, maybe it's enough to fill about 10 pages from this 2 years, the highlights, the most dramatic moments. And I was really saddened by this because those 10 pages I really liked. Yeah. I felt like I'd really got something. And so I showed them to somebody, and they said, you know what you need to do? Because I'd taken these moments and I'd linked them with flashbacks and memory. They said, write it from beginning to end. Write the story from beginning to end. And I said, I can't because I don't remember everything. And they said, make it up. And I said, but it's my life. I can't make it up. And they went, you're a writer. Make it up, for God's sake, you wimp. That's how I heard it. And it was the best piece of advice I ever had. I went right that minute, and sat down and wrote what became the first chapter of the book, which is something I didn't remember at all. And I continued on, but what I did remember was the atmosphere, the essence of the story, of what happened to me. And what I realized as I continued to write was you don't have to know so much, you don't have to look outside, you just have to look inside, and everything is there, waiting to be kind of formed. And that's something that I learned through the process of writing that novel. With the other novels that I've written in my life, some of them have been semi-autobiographical or inspired by my life, but not in such an obvious way. And I have trusted that process as the years have gone by, that if I look inside, there will be things that I didn't even know were there. I was actually listening to the radio last week, and Richard Flanagan, who won the Booker Prize last year, was asked if he had done a lot of research about his novel set in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. And he said, I didn't, because I noticed, and I took this really from him. He said, I realized the more I wrote that I didn't have to look outside. What I needed to find was inside myself. And when I teach sometimes, I learned a lot about what makes somebody either right or not right, especially when it's very personal. And I noticed it's really a matter of courage. The people that are most stopped, the things that most stop people writing is discipline, which is a big thing, but the other one is, what will my mother say? And I really did struggle with that myself. You know, nobody wants their little child to grow up and remember an awful lot of what happened when they were 5. I really hope my kids do not remember that myself. And so when I was writing, I did have kind of waves and pangs of guilt. And I noticed there's certain things that made me feel better, like making my mother the most beautiful woman ever. And it was my mother, actually, who was played by Kate Winslet. So that really worked. And it did soften the blow.
Yeah.
And I use that, you know, and also people will be offended or not. You can never guess. And also some people will choose wonderfully not to be offended, or they will choose to be offended. You kind of have no power over that.
Yeah.
One of my novels, my father is created in, it's not entirely recognizably him, but enough that if he wanted to be upset, he could have been. And he said to me, I was a little concerned, but then I thought, oh no, I don't wear a watch. I was so grateful. That was the end of the conversation.
Okay, I believe we have 5 minutes left before we go to questions from the audience. We have to ask a question that's been sent to us by the audiences on Twitter through Hindustan Times. And the question is this: do you think the proliferation of memoir and autobiography, and even the craze for selfies, is a symptom of a self-obsessed age? And I leave this open to all of you to discuss and debate. I mean, has there been a proliferation of memoir and autobiography? I mean,
it's hard to tell. I think there's you could say, looking at in the very small area of British fiction, for example, that there was a generation of writers, Martin Amis, Julian Barnes. Julian Barnes has stayed pretty faithful to the novel. A lot of the others find it harder and harder to write novels the older they get.
Yeah.
And they find it easier and easier to write a kind of journalism which often involves the memoir. You know, Martin Amis's experience, I think, is his best book since his early novels, but I may be wrong about that. I certainly find it harder to write novels than I did when I was in my 20s, when I wrote my first one. And I find it harder to read novels. And I think that's a male thing in particular. That's a strange thing to say, but I've just found it to be the case. Most of my male friends read history and biography, and not much novel, except ones they go back to from the past. I read The Great Gatsby every year, you know, that sort of thing. But I hate selfies. I am just warn you, if you happen to see me wandering along in one of these passageways in this amazing place, and you ask me if I'll do a selfie, I will say no. But I'll very happily sign something for you, because if I sign something, I can look into your eyes and we can have a conversation. If you do a selfie, I just put my arm around you and someone else is given the camera, they don't know how to work it, they turn it off instead of on, and the crowd gathers. The whole thing turns into misery and despair. So no selfies as far as I'm concerned.
that escalated so quickly.
But some people just have a gift for memoir. Yeah. Alan Bennett, for example, seems to be able to turn his whole life, every day of it, into an extraordinary series of beautiful stories that everyone wants to read. And those people are very valuable, I think.
But is this a self-obsessed age?
Well, I
think
this sense that, that now we have a lot of non-fiction books that are coming out which have this authorial voice, they have this I in it. And I don't really see that as a sort of case of sort of blatant self-obsession. I see it as what anthropologists have been doing for years. If you're going to write about something, you have all your unconscious biases, you have your own kind of understanding of what's going on that comes from your own upbringing and who you are. And if you put yourself in the book, I think it just makes it a fairer read. I think it's important. It's the opposite of self-obsession, I think. It's a much more balanced way of writing.
But what writers are usually told when they're young also is that you write what you know first.
And
they're also told everybody has one book in them which is a story of their own lives, right? And so is it true perhaps that they reach for that book in them, which is the book about their own lives, and they kind of put that out there first, and the novel is something...
In which they are either Christ or Faust. In the first novel, especially male, they either play someone who sacrifices themselves for the world, or someone who sells their soul to the devil.
Yeah.
Those are the two stories.
And then they grow up.
Yeah. We're all doing one of those two things anyway, at some point or the other.
There is the injunction, know thyself, and the search for the self. To understand, most of us, I think, don't begin to understand ourselves till we write it down, start to write it. It's a way of discovering yourself. I don't think we're a self-obsessed age, but I think we're probably a celebrity-obsessed age. And I'm a little worried. I work with students on their writing, and increasingly some fascinating memoirs by unfamous people whose lives are ordinary and yet extraordinary are not finding publication. Whereas, of course, any old pop star or chef, I think, finds it relatively easy to get a memoir out there, whether ghosted or not.
Yeah. Okay, I think somebody's signaling to me, so maybe we can go to the audience for some questions. Yes, right here on the front, and then we'll work our way backwards.
Hello, this is for Mr. Stephen Fry.
Oh dear.
Mr. Stephen Fry.
You talked earlier about the kind of juvenility of Western culture.
Yeah.
Ooh, sorry, again.
I got that.
And I was just kind of wondering what your opinion was on the internet, kind of like the new zeitgeist of our times, and how really there's so many different narratives for versions of events, and how information's become so diffused through different mediums, and it's kind of become more and more confusing to understand things. And really that people now can have a weird opinion, and no one in real life will agree with them. They have an image board of people saying they're right, and Obama's controlling the weather or something. And really, sorry, this is going to be longer than your answer. But I'm just curious if you think that kind of has an effect on juvenility today.
Because you were an early adopter of technology, as
I was a very early adopter. Yes, I was on the internet in the 80s before there was the World Wide Web, and so I have watched it grow and been very interested to watch it grow. And I've been alarmed by there's a sort of systole and diastole going on, where in the 80s and early 90s there was something called CompuServe, and there was America Online, and they were like little safe places with almost like modern designed cities. And then there was this scary place, the internet, which was like a London or a Mumbai or not a Paris, which is too designed. A place which had slums that everyone was very scared of. Look what's in the internet, nasty red light districts, places you wouldn't want children to go. But also the most astonishing libraries and museums and archives and repositories of knowledge and places to exchange ideas across the globe in ways that had never been seen before. And then came a great question as Wikipedia and other things began to proliferate, which was absolutely identical to the question that was asked in the 1450s and 60s when Gutenberg designed his first movable printer, and books began to be published around, first of all, Northern Europe in particular, but then around the whole globe. So in 1450 there were no printed books. In 1500, 50 years later, there were 30 million. And the people who'd had writing taken away from them, the monks, were very alarmed, and also they waved their fingers and said, look now, all these books, no one will have to remember anything. It'll all be written in a book. And this will be the end of knowledge and scholarship, because people won't know things. Of course, it was the reverse. It was the beginning of an explosion of learning that went on through the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment and into our age. And people say the same, though, about Googling and about Wikipedia. They shake their fingers and say, no one's going to know anything. But they have access to knowledge. All of you sitting in this room who have a smartphone have more power in your pocket than Louis XIV ever had. He would have to send scholars off around the world to bring him information. What we do with that knowledge is, of course, an interesting question, but I think to be negative and pessimistic about it is really to fly in the face of our experience of the print revolution and in an understanding of the human brain, which is a remarkable mechanism that cannot be overpraised. Just as a very quick thing, give an example, and India is a perfect place to do it. Go out into a field in the countryside in India and stand, and the smallest puff of wind will turn a leaf, and you'll see the silver underside of it, and your head will turn towards it, because we have been trained through evolution over millions of years to respond to anything that might be food or might want to eat us as food. In other words, our brain can focus in on the tiniest movement in this space. But get on a train or an aeroplane and find yourself in the middle of New Delhi just a few hours later, and there will be thousands of people all around you wearing all kinds of colors, making all kinds of noises, tuk-tuks exploding and farting on the streets, everything, and your brain can cope. It can actually be on a conversation on the phone and half a conversation with someone else. That same thing that was focusing on just a leaf turning can focus out thousands of noises. And don't ever lose faith in this extraordinary thing between your ears. And that will see us through. I am convinced of it. That's
Oh, at the